Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. There is a particular kind of story that belongs to small nations. The story of a people who lived well and freely, who watched that freedom taken away by a neighbour with more power and less scruple, who fought for decades to get it back, and who eventually won not through overwhelming force but through something harder to quantify. Through the specific quality of one man's refusal to stop, even when stopping would have been reasonable, even when every rational calculation suggested the cause was lost. Tonight's story is that kind of story. It takes place in medieval Scotland in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, on a landscape of rain-soaked hills and dark forests and castles sieged and stormed and burned and built again. And it follows a man who was, at various points in his life, a traitor to his own cause, a murderer in a church, a fugitive hiding in the Western Isles with a handful of followers, and ultimately a king who won his nation's freedom in a battle so decisive that it defined Scottish identity for the next 700 years, and shows no sign of releasing its grip yet. His name was Robert de Bruce. Robert the Bruce to the English-speaking world, and his story is inseparable from the story of Scotland itself in the most turbulent period of its medieval history. It is a story about what it costs to be free and how you calculate that cost in real time without the advantage of knowing how the story ends. It is a story about a man who is capable of betrayal and capable of extraordinary courage, often in the same decade, and who had to live with both. And it is a story about a nation that discovered, under the worst conditions imaginable, what it actually valued, not the feudal obligations that bound its lords to English or Scottish overlords in the abstract calculus of medieval political theory, but the specific thing that the Declaration of Arbroath would articulate in 1320 with a directness unusual in any century, that freedom was worth dying for, and that a king who would not fight for it did not deserve to keep it. So before we begin properly, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below, knowing this story is settling over different parts of the world. At the same moment is something I always find quietly wonderful. Now dim the lights. Pull whatever you have around you a little closer. Scotland at the end of the 13th century is cold and wet and complicated and magnificent, and we're going to spend some time there. You have nowhere to be. Let us go north. The Scotland that Robert the Bruce was born into in 1274 was, by the standards of its era, a functioning and moderately prosperous kingdom. But before we meet the Scotland of the 13th century in its political and economic character, it is worth spending a moment on the physical Scotland, the landscape that shaped every military decision of the Wars of Independence, and that was, in the end, one of the most important strategic advantages Scotland possessed in a conflict it should, by any rational calculation, have lost. Scotland's landscape is not merely scenery, it is a military argument. The highlands and islands that cover most of the country's northern and western extent are among the most difficult terrain for conventional medieval warfare in all of Europe. Steep-sided glens, boggy moorland, lochs that cut across lines of advance, rivers that swell dangerously in the frequent Scottish rain, mountain passes that were the only routes through ranges that extended for dozens of miles without alternative crossing points, the great central lowland belt between the Forth and the Clyde, the narrow waste of the country where most of the population lived and most of the agricultural wealth was concentrated, was somewhat more accessible, but even there the rivers created formidable obstacles, and the bogs between the firths could swallow an army that departed from the few reliable roads. For an English army invading from the south, Scotland presented a series of natural choke points whose defence required only that someone hold the right ground against them. The Firth of Forth was the most significant. It cut across the country from east to west, and the viable crossing points were few. Stirling at the apex of the Forth's tidal reach was the crossing that mattered most, which is why Stirling Castle was the single most contested fortification in Scottish history, and why Stirling Bridge was the location of Wallace's most decisive victory. Controlling Stirling meant controlling the passage between Scotland's north and south, and the geography reinforced that control in ways that no amount of English military power could easily override. The Western Highlands and Islands were a different kind of geographic resource. They were not a defensive line but a refuge, a territory so extensive and so difficult to move through that a pursuing army could lose a quarry in it and never find him, and that could sustain a small band of men who knew it well and knew where to find food and shelter for indefinite periods. When Bruce was at his lowest point in the winter of 1306 to 1307, the Western Isles that sheltered him were not merely hiding places. They were the specific geographic conditions that made the guerrilla campaign of 1307 to 1314 possible. He could reappear from a direction that no English commander could reliably predict, strike and withdraw into terrain that English cavalry could not follow. The forests, which covered much more of Scotland in the 13th century than they do today, were similarly a military resource. The dense woodland of Selkirk Forest was where Wallace recruited and hid after his defeat at Falkirk. The woodland north of the Bannock Burn was where Bruce positioned his army on the eve of the great battle, where his spearmen spent the night before they came down from the trees to fight. The Scots' relationship to their forests was not merely environmental but military. They knew them in the specific, intimate way that people know landscapes they depend on for survival, and that knowledge was repeatedly decisive. A functioning and moderately prosperous kingdom, which is to say that it was not the backward and peripheral country that English propaganda of the subsequent wars would caricature, but a proper medieval realm with its own laws, its own church, its own trading networks, its own architectural tradition, and its own political culture. The 13th century, in Scotland as across most of northern Europe, was a period of relative warmth. The medieval climate optimum was making agriculture more productive, populations were growing, towns were expanding, and the great monasteries and abbeys that the Scottish Church had been building across the previous 2 centuries were among the finest in Britain. Melrose Abbey, Jedburgh, Kelso, Dryburgh, the border abbeys of Roxburghshire and Berwickshire, now beautiful ruins, were in the 13th century among the most accomplished architectural achievements in the country and centres of economic activity as well as religious life. Their estates producing the wool exports that connected Scottish merchants to the markets of Flanders and the wider continental economy. The country that Scotland's last great medieval king, Alexander III, had shaped and consolidated was not a modern nation-state in the sense the word would later acquire, but it was a kingdom with a genuine, coherent identity. The Scottish monarch was King of Scots, Rex Scotorum, not King of Scotland, a distinction whose specific meaning conveyed that the king's relationship was to his people rather than to a territory, a formulation that carried within it the seeds of the political philosophy that would flower in extremity in the Declaration of Arbroath. The population was diverse, Gaelic-speaking in the Highlands and Islands, where the clan system organised social life around kin networks and a warrior culture of long standing. Norse Gaelic in the far north and west, where the legacy of Norse settlement and culture blended with the Gaelic world in ways that produced a distinct regional identity. Scots speaking in the lowlands and the burghs, where a Germanic language closely related to Northern English had become the vernacular of trade and administration, and Norman French in the highest levels of the aristocracy, where the families that had come north with the Anglo-Norman tide of the 11th and 12th centuries maintained French as the language of their social world and their cultural allegiances. The Bruce family was itself a product of this Anglo-Norman immigration. The name is Norman, from Bruce, a village near Cherbourg in Normandy, and the family had come to England with William the Conqueror in 1066, and to Scotland in the early 12th century, when David thus of Scotland invited Anglo-Norman lords to settle in his kingdom and bring the feudal administrative techniques that had made the Norman state in England so effective. By Robert's time, the family had been in Scotland for 5 or 6 generations and was thoroughly Scottish in its loyalties and its social connections, though it maintained estates in England as well. The complex of cross-border landholding that characterised the Anglo-Scottish nobility, and these would make the Wars of Independence a peculiarly complicated experience for the men who were expected to choose sides in a conflict that cut across the social networks of their entire class. Alexander III had been by any reasonable measure a good king, the kind of king that medieval political thought held up as the model of what kingship should be. He had defeated the Norse at the Battle of Largs in 1263 and secured the Western Isles for the Scottish crown by the Treaty of Perth in 1266, rounding out the kingdom's territorial extent. He had maintained the independence of the Scottish Church from Canterbury's jurisdiction, with sufficient firmness that the papacy recognised Scottish ecclesiastical autonomy. He had kept the peace with England through a combination of diplomatic skill and the specific advantage of being related by marriage to the English royal family. His first wife was Margaret, daughter of Henry III of England, a connection that gave the relationship between the two kingdoms a personal warmth that restrained, for a generation, the aggressive English claims to overlordship over Scotland that had periodically surfaced in the previous century. The country was prospering, the wool trade was healthy, the burghs were growing, the great abbeys were still building. On the night of March 18, 1286, Alexander III attended a council meeting in Edinburgh, and afterward, despite the advice of his counsellors who urged him to stay the night because of a fierce storm, insisted on crossing the Firth of Forth to return to his new young wife at Kinghorn in Fife. He made the crossing on the ferry at Dalmeny. The next morning his horse was found on the beach at Kinghorn with the king beneath it, dead. Whether he fell from his horse in the dark or was thrown in the storm, or whether the horse went over a cliff in the darkness, is not established. The accounts are fragmentary, and the site was not fully identified until the 19th century. What is established is that Alexander III rode into the stormy night, and his body was found the next morning at the foot of what has been called Kinghorn Ness, and that this accident, this piece of terrible random bad luck, a king who should have spent the night where he was and chose not to, set in motion a chain of political consequences that would consume Scotland for the next 4 decades and beyond. Alexander had outlived all 3 of his children by his first marriage. His second marriage, to Yolande of Dreux, had been contracted specifically in the hope of producing a new heir, but Yolande was pregnant when Alexander died, and the pregnancy would miscarry. The heir to the Scottish throne was Alexander's granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, the child of his daughter Margaret and King Eric II of Norway. She was 3 years old. She'd been born in Norway and never seen Scotland. In 1289 she was formally designated Queen of Scots, and in 1290 she was sent from Norway to Scotland to take up her kingdom. She died on the voyage. She was 7 years old. She probably died of seasickness and exhaustion, somewhere in the Orkney Islands in the autumn of 1290, and her death produced the dynastic vacuum into which Edward of England stepped, with the particular combination of legal precision and political ruthlessness that characterised everything he did. Edward, a son of England, Edward Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, a man whose nickname the Scots applied posthumously to his tomb at Westminster, and that the English later took up as a compliment, was one of the most capable and most feared monarchs in the medieval world, and understanding him is essential to understanding everything that follows. He was genuinely tall, approximately 6'2", which was exceptional in the 13th century. Physically imposing, militarily experienced in the Crusades and in the Welsh Wars that had brought Wales definitively under English control, legally sophisticated in a way that was unusual among medieval kings, and possessed of a particular quality of controlled, institutional violence that was more frightening in some ways than simple cruelty, because it was always presented as the necessary working of law. He had fought the Welsh Wars not merely with armies, but with a systematic programme of castle building and administrative integration that made his conquest permanent rather than merely temporary. But to understand Edward fully, and understanding him fully is essential to understanding both what Scotland was up against and how Bruce's achievement should be measured. You need to understand the range and depth of his administrative intelligence. Edward had returned from the Crusade in 1274 as a king who had seen Jerusalem and survived a poisoned assassination attempt with equanimity, and who had absorbed in the Eastern Mediterranean the administrative models of both the Crusader states and the Islamic powers they were fighting. He came home determined to organise England more systematically than any of his predecessors had managed, and the legal reform of the 1270s and 1280s, the great statutes of Westminster, Gloucester, Winchester and Mortmain, represented the most comprehensive legislative programme in English history before the 19th century, reorganising land tenure, criminal justice, military obligation and ecclesiastical property law in ways that remained fundamental to English law for centuries. He was not merely militarily capable, he was an institution builder of the first order. He was also capable of actions whose cruelty went beyond what even the standards of the medieval world comfortably accommodated. The Edict of Expulsion of 1290, which expelled every Jew from England after a generation of increasingly onerous restrictions appropriating their property and assets for the crown, was one of the most consequential acts of religious persecution in English history. The Jews who had settled in England since the Norman conquest were expelled entirely, their communities destroyed, their property confiscated. Thousands of families who had lived in England for generations were given a date by which they had to leave. The expulsion served Edward's immediate financial needs. He appropriated significant assets, and his longer-term political interests, which were served by demonstrating to the English church and baronage his willingness to act on Catholic teaching about Jewish usury. Edward calculated every action, including the cruelest ones, against a matrix of political utility. What Scotland encountered in Edward then was therefore not merely a militarily powerful neighbour with aggressive territorial ambitions. It was a systematizer, a man who would use every legal mechanism, every diplomatic precedent, every institutional resource available to him to make his claim stick permanently, rather than merely winning a battle and having his victory eroded by the next generation. The insistence on the oath of homage before the great cause arbitration, the extraction of the ragman roll signatures after the 1296 conquest, the removal of the Stone of Destiny to Westminster. These were not military actions. They were institutional acts, designed to create legal and symbolic facts that would be difficult to reverse. They were the work of a man who understood that power is most secure when it wears the face of legitimacy. and administrative integration that made his conquest permanent rather than merely temporary. His rings of castles in North Wales, Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, Beaumaris, remains one of the most impressive feats of medieval military architecture anywhere in Europe, and their purpose was not merely defensive but administrative. They were the physical infrastructure of English governance, designed to make Welsh resistance logistically impossible by surrounding potential resistance with English military presence. This was what he knew how to do. When Scotland's succession crisis gave him the opportunity to intervene north of the border, he brought the same methods and the same thinking. The legal mechanism he used was the arbitration of the succession dispute, the competition for the Scottish crown that historians call the Great Cause. After the Maid of Norway's death, 13 claimants to the Scottish throne came forward, and the competing claims generated exactly the kind of constitutional crisis that medieval political arrangements, with their complex of overlapping feudal obligations and disputed genealogies, were capable of producing at their worst moments. The two primary claimants were Robert de Bruce, 5th Lord of Annandale, the grandfather of our Robert, whose claim rested on his slightly closer degree of descent from the Scottish royal line, and John de Balliol, whose claim rested on the feudal principle of primogeniture as applied through the female line. The Scottish guardians who were managing the country during the interregnum asked Edward, as the most powerful neighbouring monarch and as Alexander III's former brother-in-law, to adjudicate. Edward accepted, and in doing so extracted from every one of the claimants a prior acknowledgement that he was Lord Paramount of Scotland, the feudal superior of whoever became king, which was exactly what he needed, and which the claimants appear not to have fully understood they were conceding. Edward chose John de Balliol. The choice was legally defensible on the primogeniture argument, and it had the additional advantage, from Edward's perspective, of producing a king whose claim would be forever shadowed by the awareness that he owed his throne to Edward's decision, and who would therefore be, in theory, easier to manage than the older and more politically experienced Bruce. John was inaugurated as King of Scots at Scone on November 30th, 1292, St. Andrew's Day, at the Stone of Destiny that had been the inauguration seat of Scottish kings since time immemorial. He was technically King of Scots. Edward immediately began demonstrating exactly how he understood the feudal superiority he had been granted to work. Edward's treatment of John was calibrated to humiliate without quite crossing the line into open provocation. He required Scottish legal cases to be appealed to English courts, treating the Scottish judicial system as subordinate to English jurisdiction. He summoned John personally to answer as a defendant in a case brought by one of John's own vassals, requiring the king himself to appear in an English court in a subordinate capacity. He demanded that Scottish military resources be made available for his wars, including his campaign in France, without regard for Scottish interests or the Scottish Parliament's views. When John and his Scottish council finally pushed past the point of endurance, renounced their fealty to Edward, and concluded an alliance with France, the beginning of the old alliance that would bind French and Scottish foreign policy together for 3 centuries. Edward's response was immediate, organised, and devastating. He invaded Scotland in 1296. The sack of Berwick, the largest and most prosperous trading town in Scotland, whose Flemish merchants had their own guild house and whose wool exports made it a significant commercial centre, was the first act. Edward's forces killed an estimated 7,000 or 8,000 people in the town, a massacre so extensive and so deliberate that it was understood across Scotland and across Europe as a statement of intent. This was not the normal violence of medieval warfare, but something more systematic, the demonstration of what resistance cost. Berwick was not sacked because it had resisted particularly fiercely. It was sacked because Edward wanted everyone to understand what was coming. After the Battle of Dunbar in April 1296, where the Scottish army was defeated in a relatively brief engagement, John submitted, Edward stripped him of his royal insignia in the formal ceremony of degradation that symbolised the end of his kingship. The coats of arms were physically torn from his surcoat, earning him the nickname Tomb to Bard, the empty coat, and took him to England as a prisoner. Edward then confiscated the Stone of Destiny from Scone and took it to Westminster Abbey, where it was incorporated into the coronation chair that English and later British monarchs were crowned upon, a deliberate act of symbolic erasure, removing the physical centre of Scottish royal legitimation. He took the Black Rood of St Margaret, Scotland's most sacred relic, a fragment of the true cross that had belonged to the sainted Queen, and sent it to England. He took hostages from the Scottish nobility. He had every significant Scottish landowner sign the Ragman Roll, a document acknowledging him as King of Scotland. He then installed English administrators to govern the country and went home, apparently believing the matter was settled. It was not settled. It had barely begun. The resistance that Edward Thumb had failed to extinguish had, in some ways created by the very comprehensiveness of his suppression, erupted in 1297 from an unexpected direction. William Wallace was not a great magnate. He was not one of the lords whose names appear on the Ragman Roll, not one of the men whose complex web of cross-border landholding and feudal obligations made the political calculation of resistance particularly difficult. He was a lesser knight, possibly the son of a knight, from Elderslie in Renfrewshire, and almost nothing reliable is known about his life before he killed the English sheriff of Clydesdale, Sir William Hazelrig, in Lanark in May 1297. Whether the killing was motivated by the sheriff's murder of Wallace's wife or companion, the tradition preserved in the later account of the minstrel Blind Harry, which became the basis of the 1995 film Braveheart, in ways that are both faithful to the legend and entirely unreliable as history, or whether it was a more straightforwardly political act of rebellion, is not established. What is established is that it triggered a cascade. Other Scots joined the rebellion, other English garrisons were attacked, and within months Wallace had emerged as the most effective military leader the resistance had produced. The Battle of Stirling Bridge on September 11th, 1297 was Wallace's greatest victory and one of the most elegantly executed tactical surprises in medieval Scottish military history. The English army under John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, had to cross the Forth at Stirling, and they did it by the wooden bridge, which was narrow enough that only a few men could cross side by side. Wallace and his co-commander Andrew Murray held their Scottish spearmen in position on the slope of Abbey Craig overlooking the crossing and waited. They waited while half the English army crossed the bridge, then they attacked. The English who had crossed were cut off from reinforcement and support, and were destroyed almost entirely, including Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland, and a man widely loathed for his fiscal rapacity, whose fate after the battle the more judicious sources describe as death in the fighting, and whose skin, by the less judicious sources, was cut into strips as trophies. The English who had not yet crossed retreated. Surrey retreated all the way to Berwick. The English garrison at Stirling Castle surrendered. Scotland was, for a brief period, effectively free of English military control. Wallace was appointed Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the captive John de Balliol, and he organised raids into northern England in the winter of 1297 and 1298 that brought substantial plunder and demonstrated that Scotland's capacity for offensive action was real. He also wrote letters to the commercial cities of the Hanseatic League, informing them that Scotland was open for business again, the tone of the letters the confident prose of a government functioning normally, which was precisely the political point he was trying to make. Andrew Murray, who had been wounded at Stirling Bridge, died of his wounds in November 1297. Wallace was left as sole guardian, and the following summer, 1298, Edward returned from Flanders with the full weight of the English military establishment and the specific technological advantage that had not been fully present at Stirling: Welsh longbowmen in large numbers. The Battle of Falkirk on July 22, 1298 was the destruction of Wallace's military career. The Scottish tactical formation, the schiltron, a tight ring of spearmen whose projecting pikes could break a cavalry charge if the formation held, was effective enough in defence against direct attack, but it was not effective against sustained longbow fire from a distance. Edward held his cavalry back while his archers shot into the densely packed Scottish formations, killing until the schiltrons began to dissolve, and then sent his knights in to finish the work. The Scottish cavalry fled early. The reasons for this are disputed, whether it was treachery, cowardice, or the simple military calculation that light cavalry could not survive in the open against English knights, and without cavalry support the schiltrons were isolated formations that could not advance, could not manoeuvre, could only stand and be killed. Wallace resigned his guardianship after Falkirk. The specific location of his activities in the following 7 years is unclear. He may have gone to France to seek diplomatic support, may have been in Scotland for periods, may have pursued various diplomatic missions on Scotland's behalf. What is certain is that he continued to be regarded by Edward as an active enemy rather than a former rebel who had submitted, and that the pursuit of him continued until August 1305, when he was betrayed near Glasgow by Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight who was working for the English, and taken to London. The trial that followed was a legal formality. Wallace had never submitted to Edward, had never taken an oath of allegiance that he subsequently broke, and was therefore technically immune from the charge of treason, a point his defenders made at the trial. Edward's court dismissed this argument and convicted him anyway. The sentence was the most extreme that medieval English law provided. He was drawn through the streets of London tied to a horse, hanged until nearly dead, cut down while still living, disembowelled and emasculated with the organs burned before his face, beheaded and then quartered, his limbs sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom as a warning. His head was placed on London Bridge. The savagery of the execution, the deliberate maximization of suffering and degradation, the conspicuous use of every extreme that the law provided, tells you something about the degree to which Wallace had frightened and humiliated the English establishment. But it also tells you something about the limits of Edward's understanding of what he was trying to suppress. Wallace the man was one thing, Wallace the martyr was another, and by executing him in the way he did, Edward then converted a defeated military leader into an idea that could not be captured, imprisoned, or killed. The specific form of the execution, its public character, its deliberate extremity, its display of the quartered body parts across the kingdom, was designed to demonstrate the cost of resistance and the power of the English state to punish resistance absolutely. It produced instead a demonstration that the cause was worth dying for at exactly that price, which is the opposite of what terror is supposed to produce. The historical Wallace and the legendary Wallace have been difficult to separate almost from the moment of his death, because the legend began forming while the witnesses were still alive. The minstrel Blind Harry wrote his extended verse account of Wallace's life in the 1470s, nearly 2 centuries after the events it describes, drawing on earlier sources that no longer survive, and on the oral tradition that had been transmitting the Wallace story for generations. Blind Harry's Wallace is recognisably legendary. He is bigger than life in every dimension, his feats multiplied, and his enemies appropriately villainous. And his influence on subsequent Scottish culture was enormous. The Burns poem that begins Scots, Whae wi Wallace bled, Robert Burns's great hymn to Scottish independence, written in 1793 and set notionally as Bruce's address to his troops before Bannockburn, drew on Blind Harry's tradition for its emotional content. Mel Gibson's Braveheart in 1995 drew on the same tradition through multiple intermediaries. The historical accuracy of these works decreases with each iteration. The emotional reality they are engaging with is a constant. What makes Wallace important for the Bruce story is not merely that he preceded Bruce and created the resistance movement that Bruce eventually led. It is that Wallace demonstrated something that Bruce would spend his fugitive years learning how to use, that a Scottish force, properly commanded with geographical advantage, could defeat an English army. Stirling Bridge was not merely a battle. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that the mathematical disparity in resources between Scotland and England was not an absolute bar to Scottish military success. Bruce learned from it. He had been watching Scottish warfare for a decade before he committed to leading it, and when he finally committed, he was able to bring to the guerrilla campaign a tactical sophistication, the specific choice of terrain at Loudon Hill, the specific development of the offensive schiltron at Bannockburn. That owed something to the lessons that Wallace's successes and failures had taught, and degradation, the conspicuous use of every extreme that the law provided, tells you something about the degree to which Wallace had frightened and humiliated the English establishment. Conquered peoples do not normally receive this treatment. Men who have lost a battle and submitted do not receive this treatment. The treatment Wallace received was the treatment reserved for someone whose continued existence, or whose memory, was considered a genuine threat to the political order. Edward was right to worry about the memory. The execution made Wallace a martyr, and martyrs are more powerful than men. The image of Wallace being cut down from the gallows still living, the sentence being read to him as he was dying, refusing by every account to show fear, real or constructed, the image was what survived, became the central icon of Scottish resistance and remained so, whatever the historical liberties the subsequent tradition has taken with the man. Robert the Bruce had been watching all of this, and his watching had not been simple or consistent. But to understand why his path was so complicated, you need to understand the specific social situation of the Anglo-Norman nobility in Scotland, whose position was unlike that of any other social class in the conflict, and whose divided loyalties were not moral failures, but the natural consequence of a social structure that the wars were tearing apart. The great families of the Scottish nobility, the Bruces, the Comyns, the Stuarts, the Douglases, the Murrays, the Menteiths, the Beauchamp family, were Anglo-Norman in origin, with estates on both sides of what was becoming a very hard border. Many of them held land in England as well as Scotland. Many of them had family connections through marriage and feudal obligation to English lords as well as Scottish ones. The social world of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy in the late 13th century was genuinely transborder. The same families attended the same tournaments, intermarried, held the same kinds of feudal obligations to overlords on both sides of the Tweed. The idea that there was a natural and obvious choice between England and Scotland may seem obvious to modern readers steeped in the mythology of the wars, but it was not obvious to men living inside a social structure that had been organised round exactly the kind of cross-border connections that the wars were demanding they sever. The Comyn family, the most powerful magnate family in Scotland at the time, with the largest network of landholding and feudal connection in the country, was simultaneously the most committed to Scottish resistance to Edward and the most compromised in its relationship to the Scottish throne by its connection to the Balliol interest. The Red Comyn, John Comyn of Badenoch, whom Bruce killed in 1306, was the nephew of John de Balliol, which made him the closest available representative of the Balliol claim to the Scottish throne. The rivalry between the Bruce and Comyn factions was not simply personal animosity. It was a structural conflict between two understandings of who should be king of Scotland and what kind of Scotland they would be king of. Bruce's murder of Comyn was not merely a homicide. It was the elimination of the primary domestic rival to his claim at the cost of making the Comyn family, with all its networks and resources, permanently hostile. The Balliol question haunted Bruce's claim to the throne throughout his reign. John de Balliol was still alive. He had been released from the Tower of London and was living in France on his family's estates in Picardy, technically still King of Scots by right of his 1292 inauguration. The papacy continued to recognise him, not Bruce, as the legitimate Scottish king until well into the 1320s, which is one reason the Declaration of Arbroath was addressed to the Pope. Bruce needed papal recognition that was not forthcoming while Balliol was alive, and the English were insisting on his legitimacy. The disinherited, the Scottish nobles who had supported the Balliol interest and whose lands Bruce had forfeited after 1314, would be the source of the Second War of Scottish Independence that erupted after Bruce's death in 1329, returning with English support to try to restore the Balliol line. The complications that the murder of Comyn and the Balliol rival claim created were not resolved by Bannockburn. They outlasted Bruce himself. Robert the Bruce had been watching all of this, and his watching had not been simple or consistent. This is one of the most important and most often misunderstood aspects of the Bruce story. He was not a straightforward patriot from the beginning. He was a complex feudal magnate with interests and obligations on both sides of an increasingly polarised conflict, and his path to commitment to Scottish independence was a long one, shaped by family calculation, personal ambition, and eventually by the convergence of those interests with what Scottish independence actually required. His grandfather Robert de Bruce, 5th Lord of Annandale, had been the primary rival claimant to John de Balliol in the great cause of 1290 to 1292. When Edward awarded the throne to Balliol, the Bruces were bitterly disappointed. The old grandfather died the following year, reportedly heartbroken by the decision, and the family's relationship to Balliol's kingship was correspondingly hostile. When the Scottish rebellion against Edward broke out in 1295 and 1296, the Bruces initially supported Edward against Balliol, partly out of hostility to the Balliol faction, and partly because they held English estates in Huntingdon and Cleveland that Edward's favour was protecting. Robert the Bruce, our Robert, who had become Earl of Carrick in 1292 when his father resigned the title to him, joined the rebellion against English rule in 1297, after some months of inaction, apparently persuaded that Scottish independence was the only path to the throne his family had sought. He served as one of the guardians of Scotland after Wallace's resignation, alongside John Comyn, the Red Comyn, nephew of John de Balliol and leader of the most powerful magnate family in Scotland, a man whose relationship to the Bruce was one of the defining tensions of the period. The two men disliked and distrusted each other, had competing claims and competing visions for Scotland's future, and cooperated with the enforced awkwardness of rivals who needed each other. In 1302, when it became clear that the immediate prospect of French support for Scotland was evaporating, the French and English concluded the Peace of Paris, leaving Scotland without its ally. Bruce defected to Edward's side, submitted, and was received back into Edward's peace. His specific reasons for the defection are not entirely clear. He had lands and interest to protect, the military situation was deteriorating, and he may have calculated that submission was the only way to preserve his position for the eventual opportunity to claim the throne. The father, Robert de Bruce, 6th Lord of Annandale, died in 1304. From that point, Robert appears to have been actively planning to seize the Scottish throne rather than simply preserving his position under English rule. He enlisted the support of Bishop Wishart of Glasgow and the Bishop-elect of St Andrews, the two most powerful churchmen in Scotland, who had concluded that the only hope for Scottish independence was a strong Scottish king. He needed to deal with the common problem. The meeting that changed everything happened in the Greyfriars Church at Dumfries on February 10th, 1306. Robert and John Comyn met, possibly to discuss a political arrangement, possibly in the context of already existing tensions. The sources are conflicting, and Robert killed him. The specific circumstances are lost in the murk of conflicting testimony and later legend. One account has Robert stabbing Comyn at the altar. Another has the initial violence being Robert's companions who finished what Robert began. Barber's account in the Bruce poem has Robert striking Comyn with a blow and sending his companions back to ensure Comyn was dead. What is not disputed is that John Comyn died in a church, before an altar, killed by Robert de Bruce and his associates, and that the consequences were enormous. Killing a man was one thing. Killing him in a church was sacrilege. Killing the most powerful magnate in Scotland without a trial was political catastrophe. The Comyn family, which was the largest and most extensively connected magnate network in the country, became the Bruces' implacable enemies from that moment. Edward then excommunicated Bruce and declared him outlaw. Pope Clement V excommunicated him for the church killing. The two most powerful institutions in the medieval world, the English crown and the papacy, had simultaneously declared him their enemy. He had made himself Scotland's most wanted man, the most endangered person in Britain. He also had no alternative but to go forward. Bruce was crowned King of Scots at Scone on March 25th, 1306, in a ceremony of deliberate symbolism. But the ceremony's specific emotional and political weight requires some context about what Scone meant to the people watching it, because the inauguration of a Scottish king at Scone was not merely a legal formality, but a participation in a ritual tradition of extraordinary antiquity and deep cultural resonance. The Stone of Destiny, the Lia Fael, the stone that Scottish monarchs has been inaugurated upon since time immemorial, which may originally have been an Irish coronation stone brought to Scotland by the Dalriata, which was certainly among the most sacred objects in Scottish royal culture, was not at Scone. Edward III had taken it to Westminster in 1296 and incorporated it into the coronation chair, where it remained until 996, when it was returned to Scotland and is now kept in Edinburgh Castle. The ceremony without the stone was an improvisation, and everyone present knew it. The presence of the Countess of Buchan performing the Earl of Fife's hereditary role was another improvisation. The circlet rather than a proper crown was another. The whole ceremony was a statement of intent constructed from inadequate materials, and the people who sealed Bruce's kingship by participating in it were taking serious personal risks for a man whose military position was extremely weak and whose political legitimacy was contested by the most powerful forces in Britain and in the papacy. What they were saying, by being there, was that the ceremony mattered anyway, that the form of the thing, even imperfectly realised, expressed a reality that needed to be expressed. Scotland was a kingdom, it had a king, and that was true regardless of whether Edward there agreed with it. The specific Scottish tradition of kingship, the idea of the king as the embodiment of the community's freedom, rather than as a feudal lord who owned the territory and the people, was being invoked, incomplete stone and improvised crown and all, at the moment when invoking it was most dangerous. Bruce was crowned King of Scots at Scone on March 25, 1306, in a ceremony of deliberate symbolism that invoked everything the ceremony of Scottish kingship had meant across the centuries. The Stone of Destiny was not there. Edward had it in Westminster. The ceremony was performed by the Bishop of Glasgow and the Countess of Buchan, who placed a circlet on his head in lieu of the Earl of Fife, whose hereditary right it was to crown the Scottish king because the Earl was in English hands. Isabel of Buchan's presence was a complicated improvisation that demonstrated both the inadequacy of the resources available and the determination to make the ceremony as legitimate as possible regardless. The coronation was real. The king was crowned. The question was what his kingdom consisted of. The answer, in the summer of 1306, was almost nothing. Within 3 months of his coronation, Bruce's newly assembled army was defeated at the Battle of Methven by the English commander Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke. But the disaster of Methven had a dimension that the military narrative alone does not capture. The women around Bruce who were swept up in the catastrophe that followed, whose experiences illuminate both the cost of the wars and the specific position of women in the political and military crisis. Elizabeth de Burgh was Bruce's second wife. His first wife, Isabella of Mere, had died in 1296, leaving a daughter, Marjorie, who had become the ancestor of the Stuart royal dynasty. Elizabeth was the daughter of the powerful Anglo-Norman Lord Richard de Burgh, Earl of Ulster, and the marriage had been contracted partly for the political connection it created. She was therefore the daughter of a major English-aligned lord at the same time as she was the wife of Scotland's most wanted man, which put her in an impossible position from the moment of Bruce's coronation. When the disaster at Methven scattered Bruce's forces and sent him into flight, Elizabeth and Marjorie and Bruce's sisters were captured by the English forces. Their treatment in captivity revealed the limits of even Edward III's ferocity when it came to noble women, though it also revealed something of the deliberate humiliation with which he pursued his enemies. Elizabeth herself was held in comfortable confinement. Her status as a high-born noblewoman and the daughter of one of Edward's major Irish lords protected her from the worst, but she was effectively a prisoner for 8 years, from 1306 until after Bannockburn, when she was exchanged for English prisoners. She never appears in the contemporary sources as a political actor in her own right, but she was clearly a woman of considerable strength. She survived 8 years of captivity, was exchanged at the age of roughly 34, and went on to give Bruce the male heir, David, who became David II after his father's death. Bruce's sister Mary and the Countess of Buchan, Isabel Macduff, who had performed the crowning ceremony at Scone in her cousin the Earl of Fife's absence, received treatment whose specific cruelty was deliberate rather than merely punitive. Edward ordered that each of them be imprisoned in a cage suspended from the walls of a castle and visible to passers-by, as a demonstration of what happened to women who supported treasonous activity. The Countess was caged at Berwick Castle. Mary Bruce was caged at Roxburgh Castle. They were not killed. Killing women would have been a political and social outrage beyond what Edward was willing to perpetrate, but they were displayed in their cages as spectacles of the king's displeasure, objects of the contempt he was directing at every element of the Bruce rebellion. Marjorie Bruce, Robert's daughter from his first marriage, was imprisoned in the Tower of London at what the sources describe as approximately 12 years old, young enough that even Edward's officials apparently hesitated to cage her, and she was kept in confinement rather than publicly displayed. She was eventually released and returned to Scotland, where she married Walter Stewart and became the mother of Robert Stewart, who became Robert II, the first Stuart King of Scotland. The entire Stuart royal line that would eventually rule both Scotland and England, the dynasty of Mary Queen of Scots and of James Thixanday, descended from the daughter who spent her childhood imprisoned in the Tower for the crime of being Robert the Bruce's daughter. The women around Bruce were not passive figures in the story. They were participants, victims, and eventually victors in the same struggle at enormous personal cost, and the 8 years of imprisonment that Elizabeth de Burgh and the Countess of Buchan endured was as real a contribution to the eventual victory as any battle Bruce won. By the English commander Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke. The defeat was a rout. Bruce had been sleeping off a feast, or so the tradition suggests, and the English attacked at dawn before the Scottish force was organised. He fled west with a remnant of his followers. At Dalry in Argyll he was defeated again, this time by the MacDougals, whose lord was related to the murdered Comyn, and who were therefore implacably hostile. His wife Elizabeth de Burgh and his daughter Marjorie and his sisters were captured by the English and imprisoned. Elizabeth in a form of comfortable custody, the others in the kind of degrading confinement that was meant to punish Bruce through the humiliation of the women he loved. His brothers Nigel and Thomas and Alexander were caught and executed. Several of his key supporters were hanged. He spent the winter of 1306 to 1307 somewhere in the Western Isles or in Ireland, the sources are not entirely clear, with a small band of followers, in the kind of fugitive existence that had nothing glamorous about it and everything desperate. Cold, wet, hunted, excommunicated, outlawed, his family imprisoned, his cause apparently destroyed, his king's role a legal fiction that no portion of Scotland actually acknowledged on the ground. This is the moment that produced the spider legend, the story that Bruce, lying in his cave, dispirited, watched a spider attempt to spin a web and fail 6 times before succeeding on the 7th try, and took from the persistence of a small creature a lesson about not giving up. The story is first recorded by a writer in the 14th century, and may not be literally true. It is emotionally true about the situation it describes, which is why it has been told to Scottish schoolchildren for 7 centuries and shows no sign of stopping. What we know with certainty is that Bruce came back. He crossed to the Scottish mainland in February 1307, landed in his earldom of Carrick, and began a guerrilla campaign that was calibrated to the specific military situation with a tactical intelligence that his subsequent career would confirm was genuine. He did not seek pitched battle. Methven and Dalry had taught him what happened when he sought pitched battle without the forces to win it. He moved fast, attacked when he had local superiority, disappeared before reinforcement could arrive, struck English supply lines and English garrisons rather than English field armies. He burned castles he captured rather than garrisoning them, understanding that a small force cannot hold fortifications against a determined enemy, and that a burned castle cannot be retaken and used against you. His strategy was to wear down English presence in Scotland, rather than to defeat English armies in the field. The Battle of Glentrool in April 1307 was a skirmish by any objective measure, an ambush on an English force in difficult hill country, but it was the first success since the coronation, and it mattered enormously for morale. The Battle of Loudon Hill the following month was the first genuine pitched battle success. where Bruce used the same geographical logic that had made Thermopylae and Stirling Bridge effective. He chose ground where the narrowing of the available fighting space neutralised English cavalry, dug ditches to further constrict the English approach, and deployed his schiltrons in a formation that Emma de Valence's horse could not break. He won. The victory demonstrated that the tactical lessons of the previous year had been learned, and it demonstrated to Scots across the country that the new king could win. The death of Edward III in July 1307 changed everything. But before we follow the campaign that his death opened, it is worth pausing on the men who made that campaign possible. Because Robert the Bruce did not win Scotland's independence alone, and the lieutenants who served him through the years of guerrilla warfare and pitched battle deserve recognition that the traditional narrative's focus on the king himself tends to obscure. Sir James Douglas, the Black Douglas, known by that name partly for his dark complexion and partly for the terror he inspired in northern England, was perhaps the most important military subordinate in the Wars of Independence and one of the most remarkable military figures in medieval Scottish history. He was the son of Sir William Douglas, who had been imprisoned in the Tower of London after the 1296 conquest and died there, and his personal motivation for resistance to English rule was therefore not merely ideological, but intensely personal. The English had killed his father and taken his family's lands. When Bruce was crowned in 1306, Douglas was among the first to join him, and he remained one of the most loyal and most capable of the king's commanders through every subsequent phase of the campaign. Douglas's military style suited perfectly the guerrilla strategy that Bruce adopted after Methven. He was fast, aggressive, and psychologically attuned to the specific requirements of terror as a military tool, not the formalized terror of massacre, which creates enemies and requires constant maintenance, but the more targeted terror of appearing where you were not expected and disappearing before you could be caught. His raids into northern England, conducted throughout the 1310s and 1320s, were models of the specific kind of mounted warfare that the Scottish light cavalry could conduct against a heavier English force. Sudden strikes, rapid withdrawal, the burning of specific targets chosen to maximize economic and psychological damage, the taking of tribute from communities that could not resist. The north of England paid tribute to Douglas to avoid being burned, effectively a protection racket conducted by the Scottish state through its most feared military commander, and the payments were substantial enough to contribute meaningfully to the financing of the Scottish war effort. Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, was a different kind of commander, more administratively capable than Douglas, more willing to engage in the political and institutional work of governance alongside the military work of the campaign. He was Bruce's nephew, which gave the relationship a personal dimension, and he served as one of the guardians of Scotland during the minority of Bruce's son David II, providing continuity of capable leadership into the generation after Bruce. His capture of Edinburgh Castle in 1314, achieved by a small force that scaled the castle rock at night using a route known to a local man who had used it for clandestine romantic purposes, was one of the most audacious military operations of the entire campaign and demonstrated the specific Scottish approach to castle warfare, not the slow, methodical siege that conventional medieval castle-taking required, but the sudden, unexpected night assault that rendered the defender's numerical advantage irrelevant. Edward Bruce, the king's brother, was the most complex of the lieutenants, brave, aggressive, capable of extraordinary acts of military courage, and possessed of a political judgment that was consistently worse than his military talent. His rash agreement with Sir Philip de Mowbray over Stirling Castle was the decision that forced Bannockburn, and it could have been catastrophic. The fact that it wasn't, that Bannockburn was a decisive Scottish victory rather than a disaster, was largely Robert's achievement in turning an impossible situation into an opportunity. Edward's subsequent campaign in Ireland, where he was made High King of Ireland by some of the Irish lords, and where he conducted a campaign of such destructiveness that it left Ireland worse off than the English had, and where he died at the Battle of Falkirk in 1318, was another example of the same pattern. Magnificent personal courage deployed in service of a strategic vision that was not quite as sound as the courage was genuine. The death of Edward IV in July 1307 changed everything. Edward was at Burgh by Sands, north of Carlisle, on his way to Scotland to personally lead the campaign against Bruce when he died. He was 68 years old and had been ill for months but had insisted on continuing north. His death passed the English throne to his son Edward II, and Edward II was, in almost every respect that mattered for the Scottish conflict, the opposite of his father. Where Edward I had been capable, methodical, and ferocious in the prosecution of his military and political projects, Edward II was vain, easily distracted, more interested in his personal favourites than in the governance of his kingdom, and unable to command the respect of the English baronage that his father had held through sheer force of personality and demonstrated competence. The English barons, who had been formidable adversaries under Edward the Heir, became preoccupied with the domestic politics of the English court under Edward II, and Scotland was not their primary concern. Bruce used the following 7 years with extraordinary efficiency. He systematically reduced the castles and garrisons that the English still controlled in Scotland, castle by castle, using the scorched earth strategy that prevented retaking what he captured. He defeated the Commons, his domestic enemies, in the north, breaking their power at the Battle of Inverary in 1308 and the Pass of Brander in 1309, progressively eliminating the Scottish lords who had remained loyal to the English or to the Balliol interest. He held parliaments, organised assemblies of his supporters that gave his kingship an institutional framework beyond the personal military force that had established it. By 1314, 8 years after his coronation, his position in Scotland was strong enough that only one major castle remained under English control, Stirling. The fall of Stirling was the problem that produced Bannockburn, and the specific mechanism by which it did so is one of the more structurally interesting episodes in medieval military history. Bruce's brother Edward, a fighting man of tremendous energy and significantly less strategic intelligence than his brother, had been conducting the siege of Stirling Castle since 1313. The castle's English governor, Sir Philip de Mowbray, had offered Edward Bruce a deal. If an English army did not relieve the castle by Midsummer's Day, June 24, 1314, he would surrender. Edward Bruce accepted the terms. Robert was furious when he learned of the arrangement. The agreement committed the English crown to exactly the kind of decisive military confrontation that Robert had spent 7 years avoiding. It gave Edward II a specific date and a specific objective that made inaction politically impossible, and forced the English into a major pitched battle on a timetable not of their choosing. Robert understood that a pitched battle against the full English military establishment was the most dangerous possible situation, that the 7 years of guerrilla success had been built on the consistent refusal to fight on those terms. He also understood that there was now no way out of it. The agreement had been made, the castle's surrender had been promised. Scotland's king could not be seen backing down from the confrontation his own brother had initiated. He chose the ground, which was the most important decision he would make, the Bannockburn, the burn that ran across the ground south of Stirling, and the carse of Stirling, the flat, partly boggy ground between the burn and the town, offered the same geographic logic that had served at Stirling Bridge and Loudon Hill. Terrain that would restrict the English cavalry's ability to deploy effectively, that would compress the battlefield in ways that diminished the advantage of overwhelming numbers. He positioned his army in the woods north of the new park, chose his defensive lines carefully, and prepared his schiltrons. Now trained not merely to stand and receive cavalry charges, but to advance, a tactical evolution from the passive schiltrons that had stood and been shot to pieces at Falkirk. The English army that Edward II assembled was formidable. Approximately 2,000 heavy cavalry knights and 15,000 to 20,000 infantry, the largest force assembled for a Scottish campaign since Edward I's campaigns. The Scottish army was perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 men, mostly spearmen, with a small force of cavalry that was light by English standards. The disparity in cavalry strength alone was enormous. The disparity in overall numbers was substantial. Every objective military assessment of the situation going in would have favoured England. The battle began on June 23, 1314, and produced on the first day 2 incidents that established the psychological terms on which the second day would be fought. The first was the incident with Sir Henry de Bohun. The English vanguard was approaching, and de Bohun, a young English knight who spotted Bruce riding ahead of the Scottish line on a small palfrey, charged him, alone, with his lance couched, intending to cut down the Scottish king before the battle had properly begun, and end the whole thing in a single dramatic stroke. Bruce, on his smaller and more agile horse, turned at the last moment and split de Bohun's skull with a battle-axe as the Englishman thundered past him. A single blow from a single weapon, the King of Scotland killing a charging English knight, while mounted on a horse that had no business in single combat with a destrier in front of both armies. Robert's commanders, horrified, reproached him afterward for the risk he had taken. He said only that he had broken his axe. It was the kind of thing that passed immediately into legend because it had actually happened. The second incident of the first day was the repulse of an English cavalry force trying to bypass the Scottish position and relieve Stirling Castle from the east. The schiltrons held. The cavalry was driven back with losses, including Sir Robert de Clifford, who was killed in the engagement. The English halted and made camp on the carse. The dispositions for the second day had Edward II in the position of a man who had crossed the Bannockburn and was now committed to fighting on the wet, marshy ground between the burn and the Scottish position. He had made the crossing in the night, apparently believing the Scots would not advance to meet him, and that the dawn would find the Scottish army withdrawing. He was wrong. Bruce ordered his schiltrons forward at dawn on June 24th. The spearmen descended from the woods in their divisions, 4 great blocks of spearmen organised in schiltron formation, and advancing, not standing, not waiting to receive a cavalry charge, but coming forward across the ground toward the English position. It was, for the English, a disorienting reversal of expectations. Scottish infantry did not advance against English cavalry in the open. The schiltrons were supposed to stand and wait. But these schiltrons were coming on, their pikes projecting forward at the precise angle that made a cavalry charge suicidal, and that made it impossible for any individual horse to find a gap in the hedge of steel. The English cavalry charged, because that was what cavalry did, because there was no obvious alternative, and broke against the schiltron walls. The tight formation held. The horses that came close enough to the pikes were wounded or killed, throwing their riders. The knights who survived the initial impact tried to find the gaps in the formation that didn't exist. The cavalry milled and churned at the schiltron edges, unable to penetrate, unable to withdraw cleanly. The Scottish spearmen kept advancing. The English archers, which had been decisive at Falkirk, were deployed but had no room to operate effectively. The English cavalry was between the archers and the Scottish infantry, and shooting into the melee would kill as many English as Scots. A small Scottish cavalry force under Sir Robert Keith drove the archers from their position before they could find an angle. The decisive moment, or one of the decisive moments, came when a crowd of camp followers and servants who were watching from the ridge of the Gillies Hill behind the Scottish position moved into view, apparently waving improvised banners. The English, looking at the ridge and seeing what appeared to be another Scottish reserve army emerging, broke. It is an undramatic way for one of the most important battles in Scottish history to turn, but the medieval battle mind was highly susceptible to exactly this kind of panic. The appearance of an unexpected force on a flank or rear that made continued engagement seem futile. The English rout was rapid and comprehensive once it started. Edward Secker fled the field, barely escaping capture, and was eventually taken off by ship. The English dead were enormous. Specific figures are disputed, but multiple thousands of men. The prisoners taken included nobility enough to fund significant ransom payments. The victory was decisive. Bruce reportedly wept when told of it. Bannockburn did not end the war. The 14 years between the battle and the Treaty of Northampton were years of continued pressure and systematic Scottish offensive action, and the specific character of that pressure, concentrated in the border regions of northern England but extending as far south as Yorkshire and Lancashire in the most aggressive raids, is worth understanding because it was as much a deliberate policy as the guerrilla campaign of the previous years had been. Bruce's strategy after Bannockburn was to make continued English non-recognition of Scottish independence economically unsustainable. The English crown would not acknowledge his kingship. The English nobility would not acknowledge Scottish independence. The papacy would not recognise him as king. Very well. He would conduct a sustained campaign of devastation in northern England that would continue until the economic cost of the raids and the diplomatic cost of the continued warfare were greater than the concessions England would have to make to end it. The raids that James Douglas and other Scottish commanders conducted into Northumberland, Cumberland and Yorkshire in the years after Bannockburn were not random violence. They were systematic pressure applied to specific targets: the lands of English lords, the wealthy abbeys and priories of the north, the towns that served as commercial centres for the region, designed to compel English acknowledgement of what the battlefield had established. The communities of northern England paid. They paid in burned buildings and slaughtered livestock and the destruction of the agricultural infrastructure that took years to rebuild. They also paid literally. When they had the money, they bought truces from the Scottish commanders, paying tribute to avoid being burned, and the Scottish kings used these tributes as a form of revenue extraction from enemy territory that partially compensated for Scotland's limited tax base. The amounts paid could be substantial. The Abbey of Holm Cultram in Cumberland, for example, paid repeatedly for truces across the period, the records of these payments surviving in the Abbey's accounts as a measure of the specific financial impact of Scottish military pressure. The diplomatic campaign proceeded in parallel. The Scottish Church, under Bishops Lamberton and Wishart, who had been among Bruce's earliest and most committed supporters, conducted a sustained effort to secure papal recognition of Bruce's kingship and of Scottish ecclesiastical independence. The Declaration of Arbroath of 1320 was the most famous document of this campaign, but it was not the only one. The same diplomatic packet that included the Baron's Declaration also included letters from Bruce himself and from the Scottish bishops, all making different aspects of the same argument to Pope John VI. The Pope did not immediately grant recognition. but the sustained diplomatic offensive eventually eroded his resistance, and the papal bull of 1329 that granted the Scottish king the right to be anointed and crowned by the Bishop of St Andrews, a specifically papal concession that elevated the status of Scottish kingship within the Catholic Church's institutional framework, was one of the last acts of Bruce's reign, and one he'd been working toward for years. The death of Edward II, murdered at Berkeley Castle in 1327 by agents of his wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, after being deposed by a baronial revolt, finally created the political conditions for the peace that Bruce had been pressing for. Edward III, the new English king, was a minor, and the regency government of his mother Isabella and Mortimer was in no position to maintain expensive and apparently futile Scottish wars alongside its other political difficulties. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was concluded in March 1328, and it was as complete a diplomatic victory as Bannockburn had been a military one. English recognition of Robert as King of Scots, English renunciation of all claims to feudal superiority over Scotland, a substantial financial payment from England to Scotland as reparation for the damages of the wars, and the marriage of Bruce's son David to Edward III's sister Joan to cement the peace between the kingdoms. Scotland's independence was not merely won militarily. It was recognised diplomatically by the power that had been trying to deny it for 30 years. Bannockburn did not end the war. Edward II, humiliated and furious, refused to recognise Bruce's kingship or Scottish independence, and the formal diplomatic acknowledgement of what Bannockburn had demonstrated militarily would not come for another 14 years. What Bannockburn did was make Scotland's position militarily secure. After 1314, no English army came north to Scotland in force for a generation, and the raids that Bruce conducted into northern England, burning and blackmailing as far south as Yorkshire, were offensive operations by a militarily confident Scottish kingdom, rather than the desperate guerrilla actions of a king fighting for survival. The years between Bannockburn and the Treaty of Northampton in 1328 were marked by the continued pressure of Scottish raids into England, raids that the English chroniclers describe with the desperation of communities being systematically pillaged, and by the diplomatic campaign that Bruce conducted simultaneously on the European and papal stages, trying to secure the international recognition that would make Scottish independence unquestionable. The most important document of that campaign was the Declaration of Arbroath, sealed on April 6, 1320. The declaration was a letter to Pope John XV, written in the names of the Scottish nobility, and addressed to the Pope partly as a plea for his recognition, and partly as a response to his excommunication of Bruce for continuing to wage war despite papal demands for a truce. It was composed, almost certainly by Bernard de Linton, Abbot of Arbroath and Chancellor of Scotland, a man of considerable Latin learning, whose prose combined the conventions of medieval diplomatic correspondence with passages of genuine rhetorical fire, and it was sealed by 8 earls and 45 barons. Its argument was carefully constructed. It traced the history of the Scots from ancient times, established the continuity of the kingdom over 113 kings unbroken by a foreigner, described Edward VI's devastation of Scotland in terms that were designed to move a pope whose own temporal interests were not served by English dominance of northern Britain, and then arrived at the passage that has made it one of the most remarkable political documents of the medieval world. The passage that matters most, the passage that has been read and quoted and translated and inscribed on monuments ever since, is the one that sets out the relationship between the king and the people. Even he, the writer said of Robert, even the king himself, if he were to make Scotland subject to the English, they would expel him and choose another. For it is not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up but with life itself. The Latin is more resonant than any translation. Pro libertate sola, quam nemo bonus nisi simul cum vita amittit. But the English carries the essential charge, freedom alone, for its own sake, which no honest man relinquishes except with his life. This is extraordinary in its context. Medieval political theory organised the world around the obligations of the feudal hierarchy. The king owed his kingdom to God, the nobles owed their service to the king, and the relationship was essentially vertical, a chain of obligation descending from the divine through the monarch through the aristocracy. The Declaration of Arbroath inverts part of this by making the king's tenure conditional on his service to the national community. He holds the kingdom not from God alone but from the people, and the people's obligation to him ceases if he fails to defend their freedom. This is not democracy in the modern sense. The people in question are the barons and earls who sealed the document, not the common population. But it is a statement about the conditional nature of royal authority and the primacy of freedom as a political value that has few parallels in the medieval world and that reads, across 7 centuries, with the directness that makes it feel contemporary. The document did not immediately persuade the Pope, who urged reconciliation rather than granting recognition. But it was part of the sustained diplomatic pressure that eventually produced the Treaty of Northampton, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, or the Treaty of Edinburgh as the Scots called it, signed in March 1328. By that time Edward II had been deposed and murdered by his own barons, replaced by his son Edward III, and the new English government was in no position to maintain the Scottish wars alongside its other political difficulties. The treaty recognised Robert Thumb as King of Scots, recognised Scotland as an independent kingdom, and renounced all English claims to feudal superiority over Scotland. Scotland had its independence, formally acknowledged by the English crown for the first time since the disaster of 1296. Robert died on June 7, 1329, at his manor of Cardross near Dumbarton, approximately a year after the treaty was signed. He was 54 years old. The disease that killed him is described in the 14th century sources as lepra, and historians have debated for centuries whether this was leprosy in the modern clinical sense or one of the other conditions that medieval medicine classed under the same term. His body was buried at Dunfermline Abbey, the traditional burial place of Scottish kings, with the ceremony appropriate to a king who had spent 23 years fighting for his country and had won. His heart, at his request, was embalmed and taken on crusade by Sir James Douglas, the Black Douglas, to fulfil the vow Bruce had made to crusade that illness and war had prevented him from honouring. The heart did not reach the Holy Land. Douglas died fighting the Moors in Spain in 1330, and the heart was recovered and returned to Scotland, where it is buried at Melrose Abbey under a marker that simply reads, "A noble heart may Haefnain ease, gif freedom faili." The physical landscape that Robert fought across is still there, though transformed by 7 centuries of agricultural improvement and urban development. The Bannockburn site has a visitor centre and a statue of Bruce, though the exact location of the main battle remains uncertain enough to have generated scholarly dispute. Stirling Castle, which Edward Bruce's rash agreement compelled his brother to fight for and which Bruce captured after Bannockburn, still commands the same strategic crossing of the Forth that made it the most fought-over castle in Scotland. The great border abbeys, Melrose where the Bruce's heart lies, Jedburgh, Kelso, Dryburgh, are ruins now, burned repeatedly across the wars of independence and after, but ruins of a grandeur that still conveys what they were. The Declaration of Arbroath is in the National Records of Scotland, kept in controlled conditions and shown publicly only rarely because it is fragile. Wax seals hanging from it. The Latin text still legible for those who can read it, one of perhaps 50 documents whose significance to a nation's sense of itself transcends what any single piece of parchment can bear. Before we arrive at the legacy, it is worth asking what the Wars of Independence felt like from the inside. Not from the perspective of kings and battles, but from the perspective of the people who lived in Scotland through 30 years of warfare, and whose experience the historical record, organised as it is around the actions of great men, has largely failed to preserve. The ordinary people of Scotland in the late 13th and early 14th centuries were overwhelmingly farmers, cultivators of the thin soils of the Scottish lowlands and river valleys, working land that required constant labour and that was always vulnerable to the vagaries of weather and of military events over which they had no control. The Scottish climate of the period was beginning to deteriorate from the relatively benign conditions of the medieval warm period. The early 14th century would bring episodes of the Great Famine that hit northern Europe broadly, with crop failures in 1315 to 1322 that caused severe mortality across Britain and the continent, hitting populations that had been further weakened by the disruptions of military campaigning. Military campaigning in medieval Scotland meant above all burning, the scorched earth strategy that Bruce employed systematically against English-held castles and English-supporting Scottish lords meant that the agricultural land around those positions was destroyed regularly, not as a side effect of battle, but as a deliberate military tactic, since denying the enemy the ability to live off the local land was one of the primary tools of medieval warfare. The English raids into Scotland and the Scottish raids into northern England both used the same method. Ride fast, burn crops and buildings, take livestock, and leave. The communities on both sides of the border experienced this repeatedly across decades, and the accumulated damage was not merely physical but social. Communities were depopulated, agricultural systems were disrupted for years after specific raids, and the rebuilding was always precarious, because the next raid was never reliably far away. The burghs, the towns that had been growing and prospering during the relative peace of Alexander III's reign, were particularly vulnerable. Berwick, Scotland's richest town, was sacked so thoroughly in 1296 that it never fully recovered its pre-war commercial position. Perth, which served as a base for both Scottish and English forces at various points, changed hands multiple times and suffered the attritional damage of repeated siege and occupation. Aberdeen, in the north, was burned by English forces in 1336 in the Second War of Independence, the conflict that flared after Bruce's death. The church that served these communities was simultaneously an institutional actor in the political drama. The bishops and abbots who supported Bruce and whose financial and administrative resources were essential to his campaigns, and a provider of material support and relief to populations under stress. The monasteries functioned as something approaching social services organizations in periods of food scarcity, providing what relief their resources allowed, and the records of the great border abbeys reflect the strains of a period in which normal agricultural production was disrupted and normal trading relationships broken. The monks themselves were not immune. The repeated burning of the border abbeys, first by English forces and later by Scottish retaliatory burning of English ecclesiastical buildings in the cross-border raids, destroyed libraries and artistic works that cannot be recovered. The Wars of Independence did not only destroy, they also, in the specific way that extreme external pressure tends to do, accelerated the formation of a Scottish national consciousness that was qualitatively different from what had existed before. Alexander III had ruled a kingdom that thought of itself in primarily dynastic and feudal terms. Loyalty was to the king as a person and to the feudal hierarchy as a structure, not to Scotland as an abstract national community. The wars forced a rethinking. When the nobles sealed the Declaration of Arbroath, they were articulating a theory of political obligation that ran from king to community and back again, a theory that the war had made necessary because without it there was no principled basis for continued resistance against overwhelming English force. The community of the realm, the phrase that appears repeatedly in the sources of the period, was not a pre-existing social reality that the wars uncovered. It was a political idea that the wars created in the specific crucible of shared suffering and shared resistance. The Bruce's legacy in Scottish culture has been continuous and intense in a way that differs from the kind of national hero commemoration that most countries maintain as a matter of historical obligation. He's not merely a figure from the past who's remembered respectfully. He's an active presence in Scottish identity, invoked in political contexts whenever the question of Scottish self-determination returns to public debate, which it has done repeatedly across the centuries and which in the early 21st century has been doing with particular intensity. The Declaration of Arbroath is quoted in the debates of the Scottish Parliament. His battles are walked by visitors and school groups. His spider story is the first piece of Scottish history that many Scottish children learn. The specific quality of the thing he accomplished, independence achieved against overwhelming odds through a combination of military skill, tactical intelligence, political patience, and the refusal to accept defeat when defeat was the rational response, has lodged itself in the Scottish national imagination as the defining example of what Scotland can do when it has to. This is not without its complications. The historical Bruce was not the uncomplicated patriot of legend. He betrayed the Scottish cause more than once before he committed to it irrevocably in 1306. He killed a man in a church. He used scorched earth tactics that devastated the communities he was supposed to be liberating. He conducted raids into northern England that were acts of systematic destruction against civilians who had nothing to do with the political decisions of the English crown. He was a medieval magnate pursuing his own interests in a conflict where those interests eventually aligned with Scottish independence, and the alignment was not always clean or consistent. And yet, he went back when going back was suicidal. He spent months as a fugitive with a price on his head in the islands off his own coast. He watched his family imprisoned and his brothers killed. He spent 8 years conducting a military campaign against impossible odds, and turned those odds around through a combination of tactical intelligence, personal courage. The De Bohun incident is not an isolated example, but one of many personal acts of combat leadership that the sources record, and the specific quality of his relationship with the men who served him, who kept serving him through years when his cause looked lost because he gave them reason to believe it was worth it. The Scottish historian and Bruce's greatest modern biographer, Geoffrey Barrow, whose Robert Bruce and the Community of the Realm of Scotland is the definitive scholarly account of the man and his times, chose his subtitle carefully. The Community of the Realm of Scotland, a phrase from the medieval sources, was the thing that Bruce built his kingship on, not merely the claim of a particular lineage, not merely the military force he commanded, but the idea that Scotland was a community with shared interests and a shared future, and that the king's job was to articulate and defend those interests against external threats. He was not the most likely candidate for this role. He was not in the beginning particularly committed to it. He became committed to it through the experience of trying to do it, through the 8 years between the cave and Bannockburn, through the long passage from fugitive to king. That transformation, the man who changed under the pressure of what his situation required, is the human centre of the story, more interesting than any heroic simplification of it. There is a quality in the Robert the Bruce story that makes it different from other great military and political stories, and before we name it, it is worth tracing the specific path through which the story has come down to us. Because the Robert the Bruce who exists in popular culture is not quite the Robert the Bruce of the historical record, and the differences are as revealing as the similarities. The earliest literary treatment of Bruce's story is John Barber's The Bruce, a long narrative poem in Middle Scots composed around 1375, approximately 40 years after Bruce's death, dedicated to Robert II, Bruce's grandson and the first Stuart king. Barber was Archdeacon of Aberdeen, a man of education and access to sources and witnesses who were themselves close to the events, and his poem has a quality of historical seriousness unusual in the period. He says explicitly at one point that he intends to write the soothe of everything that he records, the truth. His poem is our primary source for many of the specific episodes of Bruce's career, including the description of the Glentrool ambush, the battle at Loudon Hill, and various incidents of the dark years between Methven and the turn of the campaign in 1307. It is not entirely reliable. Barber was writing to celebrate his patron's grandfather, which creates obvious pressures toward glorification, but it preserves specific details whose texture suggests genuine historical knowledge behind the poetic presentation. Robert Burns, writing in the 1790s in the specific political context of the French Revolution and the debates about Scottish political identity that followed the Act of Union of 1707, used the Bruce material in Scots Wahae with an explicitly contemporary political purpose. The poem's setting, Bruce addressing his troops before Bannockburn, was a vehicle for the values of liberty and resistance to tyranny that the revolutionary period was making urgently contemporary, and the poem was immediately understood by its readers as making an argument about the present as well as commemorating the past. Burns himself explicitly connected the poem to the cause of his friend Thomas Muir, a Scottish radical who'd been transported to Botany Bay for his political activities. The medieval Scottish past and the late 18th century Scottish present were being joined in a single political tradition, and the Bruce was the central figure in that tradition. The Act of Union of 1707, which had merged the Scottish and English parliaments and created the Kingdom of Great Britain, had not resolved the question of Scottish identity within the British state, and the Bruce story became one of the primary cultural resources through which Scots worked out their sense of what Scotland had been, was, and should be. The novels of Walter Scott, himself a deeply divided figure on Scottish nationalism, a Tory unionist who nonetheless devoted enormous creative energy to constructing a romantic past for Scotland, returned repeatedly to the themes of resistance and identity that the wars of independence had generated, though Scott rarely treated the Bruce directly, preferring slightly later periods for his narratives. The 20th century brought Bruce to cinema in ways that amplified both the story's power and its distortions. The 1995 film Braveheart, as noted earlier, was about Wallace rather than Bruce, and treated Bruce as a figure of moral ambiguity, present at various points in the narrative but consistently contrasted unfavourably with the purer Wallace. The specific scene in which Braveheart's Bruce betrays Wallace by fighting against him at Falkirk has no historical basis whatsoever. Bruce was not at Falkirk in any account, and the betrayal depicted is an invention, but it served the film's dramatic purposes and became, for a generation of viewers, part of the received understanding of the period. Outlaw King, the 2018 Netflix film starring Chris Pine as Bruce, was a deliberate corrective, depicting the guerrilla campaign and Bannockburn in a register of gritty historical realism rather than romantic epic, and received a more mixed popular response, partly because the gritty realism was less cinematically satisfying than Braveheart's operatic excess, and partly because correcting popular mythology rarely generates as much enthusiasm as creating it. The 2014 Scottish independence referendum gave the Bruce story an explicitly contemporary political dimension it had not had since the 1970s, when the first significant devolution debates had made the medieval independence wars a cultural reference point. Both sides of the 2014 campaign used Bannockburn. The 700th anniversary fell during the campaign year, and the Declaration of Arbroath was quoted in the arguments for independence, with a frequency that would not have surprised Bruce's contemporaries, who had written it for exactly the purpose of asserting Scottish independence against English pressure. The independence vote failed by 55 to 45%, but the debate it generated about the nature of Scottish national identity and its relationship to the United Kingdom is ongoing, and the medieval wars of independence remain one of the primary historical reference points for that debate, from other great military and political stories, and it is this. The protagonist is not a man and to whom the heroic role came naturally. Leonidas went to Thermopylae having consulted an oracle that told him what was required. Alexander the Great was preparing for conquest from boyhood. Joan of Arc heard voices. Bruce had no such sanction. He had a claim to a throne, considerable personal ambition, and a family tradition of pursuing that claim, and he made a series of opportunistic decisions that eventually trapped him in a position where the only way forward was to become something he had not previously been, a king who fought for his people because his people had no one else, and because he, finally, understood that the two things, his own survival and the survival of Scotland, had become the same thing. The spider story, whether true or not, captures this transition in the way that good myths always capture what they describe. The spider is not talented. The spider is not destined to spin a web. The spider keeps trying because stopping is not a viable option. And on the seventh attempt, which is not qualitatively different from the first six, the web holds. What changed was not the spider. What changed was the accumulation of attempts. Sometimes persistence is the only strategy available, and sometimes persistence sustained long enough changes the terms of the problem. Bruce persisted. Scotland persisted with him. The terms changed. The night has settled around you now, and the story of Robert the Bruce has come to its end. The formal end, the treaty, the death in his manor by the Clyde in the June of 1329, his heart beginning its long journey toward a crusade it never reached. The thing he won is still there. The Declaration of Arbroath is still in its archive in Edinburgh, fragile and precise. The seals hanging from it, the phrase that has never quite let go of anyone who has read it still there in the Latin, for freedom alone, which no honest man relinquishes except with life itself. The Scottish hills are dark tonight. The burns are running as they always run in Scotland, which is frequently and with enthusiasm. Stirling Castle is lit above the cars. Bannockburn is quiet. Melrose Abbey is a ruin in the dark with the heart of a king somewhere beneath it, which is an appropriately Scottish kind of monument to a man who fought for 23 years and won, and then sent his heart to a war he never got to fight, because he believed that even a heart had obligations it had not yet discharged. The spider is on the wall, the web is holding. Rest easy.